Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this inaugural webinar of the new GCI Talks webinar series. While we're waiting for everyone to log in, we have about over 40 people who have registered for this. If you could put into the chat where you're joining us from today, we'd love to know. We know that we have people who've registered from not just throughout the United States, but also around the world. So we'd love to hear if you could put into chat what country, what city, what state, what location you're joining us from. If you could put that into chat, we would love to hear from you and get a sense of where you're joining us from. Once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. While we're waiting for everyone to log in, we'd love it if you would put where you're joining us from. And in the Q&A, one person wrote they're joining us from Istanbul, Turkey. So thank you for joining us all the way from Istanbul. And anyone else joining us from some interesting places: Connecticut, USA, Tokyo, Japan. Excellent. We've got quite a global group here. So I think we'll get underway. If anyone else wants to write where they're joining us from, we'd love to know. And once again, good morning here from the East Coast of the United States. Good evening if you're in Tokyo, another person from Tokyo. Thank you again for joining the Global Citizens Initiative's inaugural GCI Talks webinar. This begins a series of conversations on topics of deep relevance to GCI's mission, including education, ethics, and global leadership. Today's webinar is being recorded and it is on the record. For those who don't know, I'm David James, the Executive Director of Global Citizens Initiative, and GCI, or Global Citizens Initiative, is a Connecticut-based 501c3 nonprofit organization that engages, educates, and empowers the next generation to become lifelong leaders of positive change. Founded by Yumi Kuwana, we're powered by a small but mighty team of 7 full-time staff members and volunteers, and I want to thank them for helping set up today's event, especially Chisato Sakamoto and Daria Hausman, who are in the background helping out with today's webinar. Through signature programs that work directly with students, secondary school teachers, and schools, GCI provides the educational tools and ongoing support to equip secondary school students with the mindset, skills, and resources to become thoughtful, committed, and ethical global citizens and leaders. And since 2014, we've impacted over 200 students, 36 educators from over 70 countries. And we hope those of you on today's webinar will consider joining one of our programs. Today's webinar is titled, "Why Do We Have Higher Education?" And we're so honored to have you, Dr. Howard Gardner, the Hobbs Research Professor of Cognition and Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, with us today. And a link to Dr. Gardner's bio will appear in the chat so you can read more about him. Dr. Gardner and his team at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Project Zero have been deeply engaged with GCI, and we're so appreciative of this really lovely relationship. Howard, with Wendy Fishman, Dr. Gardner, he recently completed a national study of higher education and a book on the study titled The Real World of College, which I have right here in front of me, was published in March 2022 by MIT Press. And much of today's discussion centers around topics emerging from this book and the associated research. Before we begin, I just want to invite you, the audience, to engage with us. So please write any questions that you have in the Q&A section. We will turn to those later on in the webinar, but you can put them in anytime. If for any reason the Q&A doesn't work, feel free to write your question in chat. So Dr. Gardner, again, thank you so much for being with us today. And I'd like to just begin by asking you, what led you to this project to write The Real World of College and embark on pretty intensive period of research with over 2,000 interviews? What was the main motivating factor that made you decide to embark on this?
Sure. Well, thanks, David, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to viewers wherever you are. I want to start by saying that the book is about the United States and the extent to which our methods and our findings are translatable worldwide is a question of great interest to us. and I'm not just being polite in saying that. My next project with Wendy, the senior author, and Bill Kirby, who's a distinguished scholar of China, is a volume on innovations in higher education around the world. Because I think one of the problems in our world today, and whether you like the United States or hate it, is the United States is often seen as the model of how to do things. And it might be because you think US is awful and you want to do the opposite, or because you think the US is wonderful and you want to do what it is. It's important for you to make this statement because it's up to each of you to think, as we're talking about, which of the lessons are really relevant to your system, whether it's in Kansas or in Kentucky or in Istanbul or Tokyo, and which ones are, we might say, American problems. And if you invite me back in 3 years, Wendy and I can tell you what we learned about innovations around the world, but this is faute de mieux, a focus on the United States. So now to the question that you raised, David. We're a research group at Harvard called Project Zero. We study education at different levels and in many locales, not just in the United States. But a lot of our studies indicated that many young people in America did not really have a sense of what higher education was about, why they were in college, how that related to what happened for the rest of their lives. And even though there are books about higher education published all the time, they're much bigger on attitude and conclusion than they are on data. So either because we're crazy or because we thought we had a lot of energy, we decided to study 10 very different schools, some of which almost everybody in the world would have heard of, others I didn't know myself. And in each school, we did about 200 interviews, 50 with incoming students, so-called freshmen, 50 with graduating students, usually called seniors, and then a smaller number with faculty, senior administrators, trustees. These are people who make major decisions like who to hire as president, and alums, people who'd gone to those schools before, parents. We talked to parents of students, to job recruiters. These are people who come to campus and try to woo you to work for anything from Goldman Sachs to Teach for America. And while I don't think I'm going to put this I don't think we had the answer to the questions we asked, but we probably know more than just about anybody else because we spent 5 years doing these studies and 2.5 years analyzing the data, and then another year or two writing a book. And we're still writing a lot about it. We have a website called Real World of College, and you can just go to it and you can see what we're writing and what we're thinking. And we have a new project focused particularly on ethics in higher education, because that's one of many things which is almost entirely ignored in practice, though not ignored in rhetoric. So in summary, we did a study because we wanted to know why kids were lost, and we figured we should get a lot of data before we answered the question. And now we have a better answer than people who haven't done this kind of research.
Absolutely. And, I guess the question that occurred to me as I was thinking, when you amass that amount of data and you meet so many different kinds of people, students, trustees, presidents, there must have been things that just surprised you that you didn't expect. What were sort of the top 1 or 2 surprises?
Okay. The biggest surprise to me was how similar the students are all over the country. We did word analysis, we did phrase analysis, we did coding analysis, all the things that crazy social scientists do. And whether you went to a well-known school, which is highly competitive, or you go to a school which basically takes anybody, or a community college, the things the students said and the way they talked were remarkably similar. One thing which we didn't expect and has really fueled our current work, fueled meaning let's get it going, is predominant when students talk about I versus we. So much of American college students is about me, myself, and there's so little about the rest of the campus, the rest of the country, the rest of the world. And the ratio of I to we was 11-1. And then we looked at the other constituencies with one exception. So when we looked at, let's say, parents and alum, the ratio there was 22-1.
Wow.
They used the word I, which is obviously egocentric, multiple times more than we. The only exception, and it's not something to dance a jig about, is that faculty administrators use the word I only 4 times as often as we. And so the focus on me, myself, and the lack of deep caring about other people and what's going on was a tremendous surprise to us. And as I say, it's fueled our present work. Importantly, all the data were collected and almost all the analysis was done before the pandemic. So you can't say, well, they're worried about their health or their parents' health. No, this was basically 2012 to 2017. So the Obama-Trump era, so to speak. The other thing which surprised us, though it won't surprise anybody today, was that as early as we began the study, the biggest problem on every campus was mental health. Let me repeat that. This is before the pandemic. This is before the Trump era. Indeed, it's before turns to the totalitarian and autocratic forms of government in many countries, including the United States. Mental health was already the biggest problem. And not only did schools not feel equipped to handle it, and we can understand why, but when we asked students who they went to for help, this was a surprise. They didn't talk to wise people on campus. They didn't talk to religious leaders. They talked to their parents and friends. Now, this is neither good nor bad, but if you're in a sector where there's a tremendous amount of help available, why don't you take advantage? I mean, one question which I injected was, if there's a serious problem, a dilemma on campus, to whom would you turn? And being, for better or worse, a Harvard person, I thought of a minister here who was very unusual in terms of his background and his orientation, Peter Gomes, but he was seen as a wise person. So whether you agreed with him about politics, about sexuality, so on, you would go to him. And this was depressing, but you asked what surprised us, and I think those would be the headlines.
Yeah, thank you. I was very struck by the statements in the book about mental health and how that came out, and you ended up dedicating a significant part of the book about that. The community piece, this piece about I versus we is very interesting. And when I think about higher education institutions, I often think about how they could form such a nice community, right? You're there with peers of similar age and your faculty, you have so many chances for interesting dialogue. You would hope this would be a place where you would start to expand your kind of, sense of, from I to we. So kind of fascinating that what you found so many students just using the word I.
Well, let me now inject something which I think is more American than the rest of the world, but it often with bad things, they spread from the United States elsewhere. Sometimes they're good things. I'm not an American basher, but certainly from the beginning of high school, for anybody of any kinds of means, the focus is on getting into college by any means necessary. And so there's tremendous amount of negotiating and positioning yourself so you can get to go to an Ivy League school or another elite school. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker, a magazine, a month or two ago, about some parent talking to her first grader and saying, well, now you're going to go to second grade, you need to start to make connections with people who could help you get into the right college. Now, that's a bit of a joke, though for those of you in Greenwich, it's probably less of a joke than if you were in Arkansas. But this tremendous notion that it's a zero-sum game, and I have to use all of my resources to get where I want to go as quickly and efficiently as possible, and to help with everything else and with other people. This is very much an American disease, and being very old, it was not nearly so true 50 or 60 years ago. It's been almost a steady trend from basically the beginning of the 1960s to the present. And of course, if so much is dependent, as Wendy put it, on earning rather than learning, and getting into the the best internship and the best first job, and never looking back, and not on developing your mind or thinking about the problems in the rest of the world, that's what you're going to get. And I mean, I think GCI's genius is to work with younger kids and to say, there is an outside world there, and maybe you can do something than just get into the best university and then get the most high-paying job and then move to a place where you don't have to see the homeless, which those of us in New York and Boston see all over every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I've heard that from a lot of GCI alums, that they truly enjoy engaging in the summit and follow-up programs that we have, because it's not transactional in nature, which kind of takes me to the part of your book that discusses sort of the ideals of liberal arts and the fundamentals of why we have higher education. And I thought it was really interesting how you talk about these 4 ways of thinking about college: inertial, transactional, which you just mentioned, exploratory, and transformational. And when I think about education, I want to emphasize the transformational side of it, but what we see from a lot of the research are how important for many people this transactional side is. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. First of all, even though I'm not a historian, I can say confidently that how people have thought about higher education in the last 200 years in the United States, in the last 600 years in Europe, in the last 1,000 of years in the Middle East changes. And as I just said, when I went to college in the 60s, we thought about it very differently. So I don't know what kind of what we call mental models you would have discovered if you looked at my class, which graduated before the Vietnam War, which was, again, tremendously transformational in this country. But without any hypotheses, and we never used the terms that you and I are using, we just listened to very carefully and asked many different questions, about 40 questions per respondent, whether they were a student or an alum or a trustee. We listened to how they thought about college. And the good news, if there is any, is that most students were not inertial. That is, they didn't say, well, I first went to high school and now I got to go to college and then I got to go to grad school or I got to get a job. Most students, or the majority of students, were transactional. That is, I've made a deal where somebody is spending a lot of money to send me here, and my job is to get through, not to flunk, not to be caught cheating, though cheating is the biggest problem in every campus, and it's not one any campus knows how to do anything about. And you and I were talking earlier about ChatGPT, the new AI technology, which is going to make it easier to cheat than ever. Get through and don't get caught and make the right connections and get the right job. So that's the majority view on just about every campus. There are 2 views which we like much better. This reflects our own values. So we don't code things in terms of our own value. We code them in terms of what we hear, are exploratory and transformational. Exploratory this is a once in a lifetime opportunity where there isn't a dictated curriculum, where I can study things that I'm curious about, but I could learn more about. I can study things which I've never heard of before, whether it's philosophy or archaeology or anthropology or some kind of computer stuff. This is what exploratory is. And again, certainly when I went to school, that was the overwhelming view of my classmates. We didn't do the study, but at least the ones I know. Where I think I might have been unusual is in also being transformational. And I'm going to be very personal here and maybe amuse you. Transformational means I'm prepared to become a different kind of person. That is, I'm prepared to have my viewpoints changed. I'm prepared to have my work orientation changed. The amusing part is I came from Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is also where Joe Biden came from. We were in fact the same age. But my joke when I was a kid is the most valuable thing is the one-way trip outside of Scranton. But of course, my ethical values came from my parents, and I've held to them as best I can. I wasn't going to sacrifice those. But transformation is an openness to be changed. And we think that's very important. Now, if Wendy were here, she would say that the most interesting thing that we encountered in these mental models was students at less well-endowed schools, often students who had to work their way through, and these students were transactional in order to be transformational. And they said, I need to get the skills, I need to get the connections that will help me to launch on a better path. And then I can really try to be the kind of person that I think will make a difference in the world and not just about me. So they see transactionality as sort of a means to become transformational. And that's very inspiring. Now, of course, it doesn't mean it necessarily happens. And there are people who go through college as being totally transactional, and then, they go do something, and all of a sudden they're working for GCI. So those things happen. But I would say if you take away a sentence from this hour, it's the focus on I and the trend toward transactionality, which to us was most upsetting, and that's really determined the work that we're doing at the present time.
It's really interesting, because even if you went into college with this transactional nature in mind, that you wanted to get out with some kind of good job, there's so many interesting studies now that show, I think it was MacArthur Foundation that said, some giant percentage of jobs that current K through 12 students will hold have not yet been invented. So we don't even know what we would be training people for if it were a vocational kind of approach. Obviously, we're talking about non-vocational, but I think it does kind of get you back to the fundamentals, right? What is the purpose?
You could have been on our research team, because once we began to get these answers, we began to ask students, well, you said getting the job was the most important thing. What happens if the job disappears in 3 years? And we were asking this in 2014. We weren't asking it in 2023. Almost nobody had even thought about that. But what I thought you were going to also say is what we called, and this was even before our study was done, the funnel effect. Nobody writes in their college application, all I want to do is to become the richest person in Texas and buy the most expensive art. But junior year, what often happens is you're studying education, or you're going to go to join the Peace Corps. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing an internship in New York City where they pay you a lot of money in the summer and put you in a plush apartment, and you can go out late at night after you've worked for 100 hours? And so the funnel effect works on people who are very, very idealistic when they start, but they face enormous pressure, not only from their peers, from their peers' parents. The parents come for junior weekend, and the kid says, I'm studying education, and the parents kind of look away or say, what did you do wrong? So these are enormous pressures. And again, those of you who are in other countries, whether you're in Turkey or Japan or some country that I didn't hear mentioned, what are those pressures, and what do you do about them?
Yeah, and you mentioned, you're not a historian, and you weren't sure what exactly we would call the mental models that would exist when you went to college. But I am curious, what goes through your mind about the forces that cause some of these changes? What has sort of caused, in your mind, some of the changes from maybe a more transformational mental model that perhaps students in the past held more of when they went to non-vocational schools, liberal arts colleges, versus today, where it seems to be the case that so many are more transactional?
That's a great question. And if I was as smart as Ezra Klein, who writes in the New York Times, I could give you a succinct answer. But I think it's a combination of good and bad. I mean, I went to college as a Jew. 30 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been admitted into college at all. The vast change in demography is good, but it's also problematic because, and I'm going to, I could probably get jailed for saying this. I mean, white, middle-class, upwardly mobile kids 60 years ago were much more ambitious for the country. They might have joined the CIA or the FBI, but they might have gone in the Peace Corps and so on. And the huge changes in the country, which everybody who's listening and watching would know about, have had positive, but also, I think, destructive kinds of ends. And we don't have to go into that in detail. Also, I'm going to be here economic for a while. The money differences in the country are dwarfed by in 1960 than they are today. During the Eisenhower era, which most people don't look up to, particularly though I happen to think he was the best post-war American president, higher income people paid 90% of their income over, I don't know, a few $100,000 to the government. And so we put in a highway system, et cetera, And now, as Warren Buffett says, he pays less percentage of his taxes than does his secretary. And for those of you who read the New Yorker, there's an article which hits close to home about somebody who spends her life until she got fired helping wealthy people escape any kind of a tax. So these things these political and economic things cannot be ignored. But as I say, there have been positive things in the country too, but their impact on higher education is very mixed. Maybe I should transition to something which I know we're going to talk about because it's relevant. And that is that if you had studied American higher education 60 years ago, and you asked what the mission of schools were, they could be given very succinctly. When Wendy and I studied the mission statements of schools and what we heard from president and trustees, we were overwhelmed. There was mission sprawl, missionitis, projectitis, to the extent that we couldn't have imagined. Just about every school in the country claims it's going to achieve more things with college than it possibly can. And so when you talk to the students at college, to go back to your original, they don't know why they're there because there's 100 different things promised. I went on some tours of colleges when we were doing a study. My team went on more. And then when my grandson, Oscar, I hope he's not listening, still asleep, he's applying to college this year, went on college tours. First of all, the educational mission is almost never mentioned. You might say, oh, here's the library, here's the science center. But, there's this club and there's this athletic facility, and every place says it has the best restaurant, and the bookstores are elbowed out by the sweatshirt displays. And so it's a shopping mall. It's a shopping mall industry. What we're most interested in, and I'm not going to mention names here, but I'll mention categories. We're most interested in those schools now where it's pretty clear why you're there. I held no particular brief for religious schools, and I still have a very mixed feeling about it. But if you're going to a sectarian school and everybody knows that's why they're there, let's say a Jesuit school, that's helpful. You're going to a military academy, and again, I'm not going to defend military, but you know why you're there. If you know to a vocational school, whether it's journalism or veterinarianism or so on, at least you know what you're there. But now if you go to this, and we should have said this beginning, we went to schools which claim to be liberal arts, which translated into lay language means we're giving you the whole disciplinary terrain. You're not being trained for a particular job. We could make an argument, maybe you're trained to be able to know what it means to go to a workplace. But of course, now that people don't go to workplaces anymore, that's moot in itself. But, I'll pick Harvard. We didn't study Harvard, but we studied schools that were as difficult to get into. And you talk to 100 people, there'd be no consensus about whether, what the school is trying to achieve. Maybe they say to try to make you successful, but that's a what shall I say? That's a code word for anything where you can end up being on the cover of a magazine will do. And unfortunately, as we know, there's some people who end up in the cover of the magazines for reasons we'd rather not have them there.
Yeah, I was really taken with that part of your book that talks about mission sprawl, and you mentioned in the book some of these college tours that you went on, and almost shocking that the actual mission, the educational mission, wasn't mentioned. It also seems like the appeal of humanities courses might be diminishing. If people are looking at a more transactional nature at school, they might take more business classes or something else. And I guess that probably has a kind of impact on the nature of schools themselves. If more students are taking business, then maybe there's a reduction in the humanities faculty. I'm not sure, but
there's massive. I mean, my wife, who is in the same cohort as I, she said when she went to Harvard, everybody studied English. Yeah, no, I mean the statistics are irrefutable. I would think, unless I was wealthy, I would think a great deal about having a kid want to become a professor of history, literature, or something, because there are no jobs. I think maybe to 20%, I'm going to throw this number, the wounds are self-inflicted because to some extent, a lot of the humanities in the latter part of the 20th century became very obscure. Deconstructionism of Jacques Derrida would be kind of the most well-known example. But the issue isn't whether you call it humanities. At Columbia and Chicago, which still adhere to some extent, University of Chicago and Columbia University, the notion is just a core curriculum where everybody reads Plato and everybody can read Confucius and everybody learns something about fine arts and everybody learns something about why we got into the Vietnam War, and that's what humanities should be. And as an old man, I can certainly say I get much more as an old person out of the humanities studies that I did as a student than anything that was more job, because I can enjoy art and literature and music and engage in conversations. Even this one is early on Saturday morning. Actually as early as 50 years ago, they did a study at MIT where they found that there were students who had graduated and had gotten a job, and at age 40, they were having a life crisis, very serious life crisis. And so they explored why. This was a psychiatrist whom I knew. And it turned out that it was students who had not studied any humanities. They'd only studied engineering and other science. And they weren't able to take a broader view of things. And especially now, as you and I were talking about, where computers can do just about anything we can do better. I'm actually not live, by the way. This is just a computer that you're talking to. And I'll say something about it because it's very interesting in a second. Unless you're able to step back and say, who are we and why are we here? Unless you had that humanities orientation, which we got in our society from the Greeks, but people got it Confucius and from Buddha and so on, you really are, you're finished. I saw something fascinating the other day, and I actually was able to tell American French historians about this. They didn't know about it. They have taken what we know about the speech that General Charles de Gaulle gave on June 17th, 1940, after the French had been defeated by the Nazis, and he'd gone to England, and he gave a speech to rally the French people to keep resisting, to form what we now call the resistance. And when somebody asked me the other day, well, why did France get to be among the victors in the Second World War? It was because of de Gaulle and what he did. We do not have a recording of de Gaulle's speech, but the Germans recorded it by, in some way, but not visual, not auditorily, but writing it down. So we now have, and it's freaky, we now have a recording of General de Gaulle giving a speech that he made on June 17th, 1940. And you think it's General de Gaulle because it's his voice. And what they found was an actor who was able to imitate his pauses and things like that. But then using some AI technology, they actually used de Gaulle's voice to give this speech. And as I'm trying to explain to my students who've never heard of de Gaulle, this is like if you could listen to Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address. But unless you have some humanities background, you're clueless about how to make sense of this. Or I give you something, I say, this is the Mona Lisa, and you can't see any difference unless you have some humanistic training, which means philosophy, art, you're lost. But I bet you there aren't five, I'm going to use my campus, I bet there aren't 5 humanities professors on my campus who start out with that insight.
Right. Yeah, I mean, all this is making me think about the earlier conversation we had before the webinar about how something like ChatGPT or AI in general forces a kind of crisis where it makes you ask questions of, fundamental questions. And with that, the ability to sort of bring back, Lincoln perhaps to read the Gettysburg Address, you start to ask the question, well, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be creative? And these don't have simple answers, but they certainly make you think.
And if you and I were starting college today, and I'm being serious now, I would say at our college the focus is, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
And we could make a good curriculum. I mean, I went into education, and I'll give you a 2-minute. Harvard just picked a new president. Her name is Claudine Gay. I've never met her. She's a child of 2 Haitians. To have a woman of color, immigrant parents is a big deal. And when she gave her opening address, she said, I never thought in my life that I would be here, because when I was young growing up with that background, the only question was, would I be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer? And I said to myself, growing up in Scranton as a child of German Jewish immigrants, my only question was whether it would be a doctor or a lawyer. Nobody was an engineer. And since I hated the sight of blood, I was going to become a lawyer. College should open you up to things you haven't thought of before. Did I ever think that I would be a professor and researcher for 60 years? I didn't have the category. And so it's a lost opportunity not to say this to young people. And if I were on the admissions committee, and I'm glad I'm not, I would try to find out people who are willing to engage that question, who actually care about, oh yes, this was the one point I wanted to make. I became interested in education when I worked for a wonderful psychologist. You may have heard of him, Jerome Bruner, Jerry Bruner. He was working on a curriculum for 5th graders. And I helped him develop this as if somebody just finished with college. And this is 1965. So it's a long time ago, 58 years ago. There were 3 questions. What makes human beings human? How do they get to be that way? And how can we make them more so? And this is before computers or anything like that. And this was for 5th graders in Newton. And my children studied the curriculum before it was banned by our US Congress as being anti-God, because they showed Eskimos who put people out on ice floes when they were old. As people are listening say, they should do that with Howard and let them go to their just reward. But yeah, maybe this is a wonderful point in which to end our open conversation, open to questions. What are the really big questions, and how can higher education help us answer it? Some questions can be understood by 1st graders. Man, a course of study, that was the name, and it was very ageist, should have called human beings course of study. This was done with 5th graders, and my kids still remember the curriculum. They're now in their 50s. But it's a question that all the great thinkers, starting with the Bible, Christ, Muhammad, Gandhi, Buddha, Confucius, that's what they were asking. And unfortunately, you can go through any college in America with everyone hearing those names.
Absolutely. Well, we have moved from why we have higher education to what it means to be human, which it all is tied together. And I think you're absolutely right. Let's turn to some questions, because we have several. And Howard, the first one, I'll just read it to you here from Rajika Bandari, is, Dr. Gardner, what implications do you think the I orientation of American students has for them as future global citizens, and more broadly, the future engagement of the U.S. with the rest of the world? Does this concern you as we think about our future diplomacy and geopolitics?
Well, the answer is of course. It concerns me. And I've gotten to the stage of life which I call the punning stage, because as I lose all of my other mental faculties, I could still make wordplay. We think, and I'm being serious, that we need to start as early as preschool. And in fact, Yumi Kawana and H. Kawana have seen this. I've written a blog about preschool in China, Japan, and the United States, because they're so different from one another. We'll send you a link. I'll do this through GCI. But we're now studying the messages as early as 3 and 4. And here's my punning. I'm calling it the we study. We, W-E meaning little, and we meaning how can you get to think beyond yourself. And I think my serious answer to your question is, except for the rare individual, higher education is way too late. We need to begin to think about we in an incorporative and not a judgmental way very, very early. And one of the things I talk about in the blog, which blew my mind, is that when a dispute breaks out in a Japanese preschool, the teachers let the kids fight it out, even to risk being a little damaged. Of course, not the 6-year-old who went into a Virginia school with a gun. But in the United States, we feel compelled to move in right away and to stop a conflict. And kids pick this up. In my first wee blog, I said, the Jesuits said memorably, it was Ignatius Loyola, give me a child till 7 and I have him for the rest of my life. And so I think my better answer to your question is colleges should do what they can, but I think it needs to start much earlier in this country. And maybe there are lots of lessons to be learned from Japan and Turkey and India and places I haven't heard of.
Yeah, that's interesting. Ed Reichhauer wrote a book, I think it was 1972 or 1973. Most of his books were on Japan, of course, but this one was on the education. And I remember in the intro to that book, he said, if you care about world politics, if you care about the future of the globe, you should care about what happens in K through 12 education, that the child entering first grade today, in 30 years will be the leader of the world, and what they're learning now will fundamentally shape their worldviews. So very much aligned with some of your points.
Good for him. I didn't know him, but he was born in Japan and became a professor at Harvard. And I knew both his kids, or 2 of his kids, and one of them became the head of the Harvard Corporation. You probably know that, Robert Reichhauer.
Yes. There's another question here relating to the relationship between higher ed and secondary ed. This is from a colleague in Istanbul, Turkey, and I'll just read it to you, Howard. How does the current higher education model affect secondary education design and experience? Could we be looking at a new model where educators and academics work together to design an agile system meeting the current and future global challenges, disruptive technologies, climate crisis, et cetera?
That's a superb question. And I'm not going to try to answer it because I can't answer it succinctly, but Wendy Fishman, the senior author of the book, thinks that that's the question. It's what she calls signaling between high school and college. She thinks colleges are by and large sending the wrong signals, and they're producing very antisocial, in a positive sense, antisocial messages to students, parents, college admissions, coaches, and in schools. So if you write to us, I'll connect you with something with Wendy, who's actually thought a lot about how to do better kind of signaling. And if you remember my allusion to the New Yorker cartoon, I don't know that we have to start in first grade, but too many high schools are judged not by the quality of the minds of their students, but how many kids they can get into elite schools. And what happens at schools like Harvard is I find disgusting. Harvard has 42 athletic teams, most of the sports I've never heard of. One reason they obviously have it is because there are certain sports which people of color don't do very much, but fencing and stuff like that. And these kids are basically told somewhere in the middle of their high school year, as long as you don't screw up, you're going to get admitted to Harvard. And I'm so proud of places like Johns Hopkins and Amherst, which is stopping all these favoritism ways of deciding who should get into college. So that's another kind of signal. And MIT, Caltech have never done this sort of thing, and they have no need to apologize for their student body or for their achievements.
Yeah, a similar question from a colleague of mine. Maybe a similar answer, but I'll just read to you. Thank you so much for this inspiring talk, recognizing this isn't the same scope of your data analysis, but considering your experience and all you learned from the research, do you think there are any other institutions, initiatives, or experiences beyond college that could achieve the goal of transformation or come close?
Great question. I think it's the right question. I think that, while I'm not in favor of military service particularly, we know that the people who came to college after the Second World War, the GI Bill, were much more mature and much more able to take advantage of the opportunities. I believe, as do most people who are in the talking head business, that a year or two of public service for every American kid would be very good, but the Congress can't even agree how to finance the government, so they're never going to mandate anything like that. But I think there are a few people, I was probably one of them, who are really ready to take advantage of college after their senior year, but that should be 18, not 15. I think it's a mistake in America to send someone to higher education when they're 15. But in general, a year, particularly a year where you have to live by your wits, not one you're just put on a yacht and taken to pleasure spots around the world. That doesn't help any. I think would be a very, very good idea. And then the more profound question you're asking is, do we need to have, I'm going to make it a bit narrow, do we need to have liberal arts education for everybody? And I guess my answer here, and I'm just inventing this, is I basically like the European system of a vocational track where age 14 or 15, you learn a trade or you learn a sector. And so, you're assured of some employment, but there should be opportunities throughout your life to read Shakespeare or to learn about, modern Japanese art and flower arrangement. It should be easier to do. And of course, with the internet now, it is easy to do. You can take courses on that, but you have to want to. And here's the key part. It's when you're young, it's easy to open your mind to those things. Why do kids become more liberal in college? There are lots of reasons, but their mind is open to things that they haven't thought about before. They're not as parochial. A very interesting book by Ilana Horowitz, who I just met through the book, was just published. It's called God, Grades, and Graduation. And the title is great. It basically says people, particularly women who go to college, and this is Protestants, are more likely to get good grades and to graduate, which is of course positive, but they become less ambitious. They want to go home and raise a family and probably be good church members, but they don't reach to be more challenged, to do the kinds of things which David and I are talking about. So in a sense, they're replaying the sitcoms of the 1950s and 60s on TV. And those are the advantages and disadvantages of a sectarian as opposed to a secular education. I guess I would like a secular education with the kind of mission that we're talking about, namely one where you're doing something not just to aggrandize yourself. And that's, again, why I was attracted to GCI. That's the aspiration. And as I know, David, from our pre-video talk, you're now trying to see what difference it may have made. And you need to be respectful of what you find, but also have a healthy skepticism.
Absolutely. You mentioned a book that you recommended, this God's Grades and Graduation. And there's a question here. What 3 books would you recommend to possible future educators as essential reading?
Well, I need to ask the person. Educators is too broad a category. I mean, if you were talking about college, then it would be very different than if you're talking about early education. Maybe I'll talk about early education because I'm getting into that now. Also, what kind of a role? I mean, it's very different if you want to be on a school board, if you want to be a teacher, if you want to be a professor, if you want to be a coach. But if it was young kids, I would say read the book by Joseph Tobin on preschool in 3 cultures. That's what got me interested in how preschool is handled in 3 cultures. The Magic Years by Selma Freiberg, Fraiberg, again by Early Education. And then a book by my own teacher, whom I mentioned, Jerome Bruner, who started this MAN course of study called The Process of Education. And I would say to the questioner, if your person is not turned on by any of these books, then go to pharmacy or go to insurance. It's not for you. I was inspired in different ways by those books.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. So there's another question here, speaking of books. Are there any new insights from the real world of college that, in hindsight, you would like to somehow incorporate into the 5 minds of the future?
Okay, well, that's an in-house question because I wrote a book some years ago, which is interestingly being rediscovered, called 5 Minds for the Future. And for those of you who know about multiple intelligences, it doesn't have to do with that. 5 Minds, I said in 2000, if I were a policymaker, what were the kinds of minds that I'd want to inculcate in students? And I think I remember the 5 minds. They were called the disciplined mind, the synthesizing mind, the creating mind, the respectful mind, and the ethical mind. My interest now, and that gets to your question, is the ethical mind. I think I've made that clear because it's so absent, but also the nature of synthesizing. I wrote a memoir called The Synthesizing Mind, and I've been obsessed ever since with what it means to synthesize. It means to take lots of stuff, put it together in a way that's useful. And I was aware of the potential of ChatGPT sometime before it became publicly known, but actually the creation of programs, I mean computer programs, algorithms, which synthesize better than human beings, really changes everything that I've thought about. Because what's the advantage of having kids learn how to do it if you can press a button and have the computer do it better? I think I have answers to those questions, but that's very, very difficult questions. And it goes right back to Bruner's question, what does it mean to be human when so many things we counted on doing ourselves or with other people are now doing better with technology that nobody understands? And here's actually an insight I got from a colleague just this week, Harry Lewis, an excellent computer science program. He said all the great thinkers in mathematics thought that ultimately the nature of thought was logical. And if we understood computer logic, zeros and ones, we could explain everything. This is not how these new programs work. They work through statistics. They know nothing, but they just look thousands and thousands and thousands of examples, and they pick out the biggest patterns. So actually, probably learning about statistics and how it works now is much, much more important than anybody would have thought of even 10 years ago.
Yeah, very interesting. We have time for one more question that I'll read to you, and then time is running out fast. I'm just looking at the questions here. Excellent. So the one interesting question here for you, Dr. Gardner, is do you read or watch any science fiction or futuristic literature or film? I ask, the questioner says, because I wonder what is the conception of the future, especially the learning space, that you think is most likely or even most desirable?
Good question, but I'm going to make a general comment and then go to the question. The general comment is, as befits somebody my age, I've been totally frank with you all, no different than we're having dinner parties together. And I don't think I said anything I'm ashamed of. But in this day of social media, it's so easy to take anything anybody says and distort it. So like Bruner's curriculum was called Man, A Course of Study. That's because everybody used the word man generically then, but now you could say, oh, he was a chauvinist pig. So I hope people will respect what I have, what I've said as being honest and not trying to cut my words to fit some current fashion. I'm going to give you a frank answer, therefore, to your question. I've never liked science fiction, either in movies or in writing. Of course, I'm aware of it, and occasionally I see something or hear something and I like, but I monitor it. So, for example, my wife and I both subjected ourselves to reading the Overstory, which was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book in 2018 by Richard Powers, who's a brilliant writer. And it's basically science fiction. It's about how trees talk to each other and they're going to save the world. And so I kind of monitor it, just like there are movies that come out. But I'm actually much more interested in good writing, and science fiction and good writing they don't collapse very much. It's in a different direction. But you and I could disagree about what good writing is. But I do monitor it, and I certainly am happy if my kids watch it or read it. But I'm very careful about what I dig into deeply, and it's not science fiction. Now, probably books like Brave New World in 1984 would have been seen as science fiction or Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner 50 or 100 years ago. Of course, now they're just insightful about the future. So sometimes science fiction actually comes to pass, but a lot of it I personally don't resonate to. But in the arts, there is no right answer. It's whatever you find interesting and engaging.
Talking about books, one of the questions students were asked in your book is what book they would give graduating seniors. The answers to this question, they're kind of surprising, perhaps telling us some of the challenges that you described earlier, ranging from the top answers being self-help related books to students simply not having an answer. So yeah, I'm sort of wondering here as we reach the end of this webinar, what book you would suggest be given to graduating seniors?
Yeah, if this had been asked in the study, I would have been stumped by it because I immediately would have said, well, what's the senior, what's his interest, and so on. And of course, now, as you alluded to, most people don't read books. Most teachers don't read books. The average American teacher, this is 20 years ago, reads one book a year. So it's kind of an anachronistic question.
Wow.
The book that had enormous impact in me was Gandhi's autobiography. Called Experiments with Truth. And one of my biggest regrets is I actually have a signed copy of that book, but I can't find it. We moved and gave away 5,000 books, and maybe some person has a signed book by Gandhi. But I wouldn't give that to many students because I think they have to be ready for it. Just like the question for an educator, I need to know more. And the cliche answers of the Bible or Shakespeare, and those are fine answers. But one thing that Wendy points out in the book is we never give a student credit or the merit for the book they chose. You could choose Moby Dick and get a low score if you didn't have a good explanation why. And if you choose a Dr. Seuss book and you had a good explanation for it, you get a high grade. So it's not the book per se, though 60% of the kids in the school couldn't name any book at all. That was very depressing. What does it mean to go to college for 4 years and not have a single book you can think of?
Yeah. Well, Howard, thank you. We have spent the last hour, and I want to thank you and the audience for joining us. This has been an extraordinary conversation, stemming from some of the key points in your book, but going all the way out to some very, I think, fundamental questions that all of us should ask. What does it mean to be human, and how do we become more human? So I've greatly enjoyed this. Any last remarks or comments you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, first of all, thank you. You are a good conversationalist and interviewer. I also want to thank GCI and the Kiwanis, with whom we've worked very enjoyably and constructively for a number of years. And again, I try to speak frankly and from my heart. I was trying not to be sensationalist, but not to censor myself. And I hope that people will respect that. I'll send David the names of the books and Wendy's email and so on if people want to follow up some of the things that came up. But thank you.
Well, Howard, that would be great. There have been some people have asked in chat for the names of those books, so that would be great. And people deeply appreciate this. One person writes, "Thank you. This was a tremendously insightful and thought-provoking webinar." And another individual writes, "Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner and GCI, for this thought-provoking session." And in fact, they want a follow-up one on what it means to be human. So there you go. So thank you, everyone, for joining. One final word to say is that today's extraordinary discussion is the start of a series, and the next GCI talks will be on March 2nd at 8 a.m. and will feature Dr. Alan Goodman, who I know Howard knows, President and CEO of the Institute of International Education. And then later on, most likely in early June, we'll have a third one with Dr. Linda Hill from the Harvard Business School, who does a lot of very interesting work with innovation. So stay tuned for those. Please join us. once again, Howard, thank you so much for joining us on a Saturday morning. Appreciate your time and your mind. This has been great. And thank you to the audience for joining us. Have a great Saturday and a great weekend.
Okay. Thank you. Best
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.